My previous video called Why Some Deaths Are Celebrated goes into detail about how badly we're being affected by certain corporations and moneyed interests and politics. And some of the stats I present in the latter half of that video will infuriate you. It's an important video. I strongly urge you to watch it if you haven't seen it yet. The world presented in that video, our current world, will change whether we want it to or not, simply because what's happening right now is unsustainable. So the purpose of this video is to present where I would like to see the world go from here. I always talk so much about what's wrong with the world, and that's important. The first step to solving a problem is knowing exactly what it is, and in many cases, that can absolutely be the most important step. You'd be surprised at how difficult it is sometimes just to do the diagnosis. Solving problems, once you know them, can also be quite difficult, especially in a world that has so much disagreement. But one thing I never addressed is where I'd like us to eventually be. What would I want the world to be like one day? What is the ideal society? Talking about that is sort of a risky thing to do. It's safer to be a critic than it is to put forth your own ideas and solutions to be criticized and scrutinized. There will always be people more than willing to tell you how unrealistic your vision for the future is, which can make you feel foolish, and it may be your instinct to lash out at them. But critics are actually important if they're constructive and intelligent. I'm not talking about naysayers and insulters who offer nothing, but actual critics who point out real problems. What matters is how surmountable those obstacles are, and if we are willing to do the work necessary to overcome them. Yes, it's foolish to cling to impossibilities, but do not think that something is impossible just because it's different from what you're used to. For instance, imagine that you're living 200 years ago, in the year 1825, and someone told you that one day people would walk on the moon. What if they told you that one day even a person of modest means could fly across the ocean in a few hours? What if they told you that one day most people would carry entire libraries of information in their pocket and watch replays of reality that range from the very small to larger than life? What if they told you that one day you'd be able to instantaneously converse with people on the other side of the planet? And what if they told you that we'd rush ourselves around in horseless carriages that easily move more than twice as fast as the fastest racehorses? What if they told you that we'd live in climate-controlled homes filled with all sorts of gadgets that do our laundry, wash our dishes, and cook our food? What if they told you that anybody could simply feed raw material into a gadget that can produce a vast array of objects, including firearms? All of that would seem absurd. You probably wouldn't believe that any of that is likely to happen, yet we live in a world where not only did all of that happen, but it's mundane to us. We experience it every day and don't even think twice about it. Go back 1,000 years and show someone. Every single day, you experience marvels that would bring someone from a millennia ago to their knees, mouth agape, eyes tearing, absolutely shocked, like they're witnessing miracles, the very same miracles that bore us. So before you scoff, consider that what I'm about to propose now is not even a tenth of the difference we've seen in reality over the last couple hundred years. I believe that what I'm about to tell you is very possible, and the only real obstacle to it resides within humanity's collective will to actually do it. You see, Almost all problems arise due to some sort of imbalance. Thus, the vast majority of solutions come from bringing things back into balance. That's true of your body, your work, your relationships, the environment, and even of society itself. When you ask someone what type of society they would like to live in, they might say all sorts of things that were influenced by pre existing biases, which are products of imbalance. This means that problems will persist even in their ideal society, and they'll have no idea why. Maybe they want the government to be Islamic or Christian. Maybe they want men and women to play very different roles and have very different rights. There's many things to consider, but a philosopher named John Rawls was known for a concept called the original position, also known as the veil of ignorance. And this concept asks you to imagine that you know absolutely nothing about yourself. It basically forces you to be impartial, which some argue is impossible, but try to play along with the thought experiment anyway. You don't know what demographics you have, what gender you are, your race, age, religion, wealth, etc. Nothing. From this position of ignorance about the self, it is posited that you would advocate for the most fair society, a balanced society, because you would not know where you'd end up in it. For instance, you wouldn't want women to be subjugated because what if you are a woman? You wouldn't want Islam to be in control of everything because what if you're a Hindu, a Christian, or an atheist? You wouldn't want some sort of caste system that has no economic mobility because what if you're poor? Now, one argument against this thought experiment is that some people might be willing to take a gamble that they'd end up in a privileged position. But let's say that you'd be unwilling to gamble. Let's just say that you want to play it safe. Now, in that case, you'd favor the most equitable society. The original position is a very helpful thought experiment when determining what the foundational principles of an ideal society should be. And that's what it's meant to do. But I think it can do something even more. I think it can teach us what it is about humanity that makes societies less than ideal. Because in every instance that the veil of ignorance corrects, it can all be traced back to a single human trait: selfishness. Remove the self from the equation, and many of our problems simply evaporate. That is from where most societal problems stem: selfishness. People seeking to gain advantages by disadvantaging others. And incidentally, it is from there that many imbalances arise. So, all we have to do is simply solve the problem of selfishness. Well, that was easy. Video over. Good night, everybody. But wait a minute. Solving selfishness is impossible because it's just a part of human nature. Is it, though? I know that's what we've been brought up to believe. Religion has taught us that we're inherently bad. But what if there's no reason to be selfish? See, I believe selfishness is not just a human trait that always exists at all times. No, it's a trait that manifests in response to specific conditions. What if instead of trying to change human behavior, we instead circumvent it by changing the material conditions that cause selfishness to manifest in the first place? Maybe that is far more doable than trying to change human nature. Society should not resist human nature. Rather, human nature should be intently considered. Society to human nature should be as ergonomics are to the human body. design for it, plan for it, solve for it. If you lived in a world of unlimited apples, would it make sense to hoard apples? Could you, for instance, corner the market on apples and charge people $100 an apple? No, that's impossible in a place where apples are freely available to all. Now, right now, such widespread abundance is not possible for all products. So we use markets to generate the supply and demand data we need. The problem with markets is that they're exploitable by the selfish. So we need a better way to distribute goods. Planned economies have also had problems historically, also being exploitable because they still have the human element behind everything, making all the decisions. The price of these lessons have been paid with many lives. But what if we removed the human element by removing the necessity to make decisions at all? If you have 10 people and each one of them wants an apple, but there are only 5 apples, you have a supply and demand issue. Scarcity drives up prices, and high prices create an incentive for inefficiency and artificial scarcity, which are purely human-made obstacles. Trade comes into play, and exploitation has a viable pathway into the system. At this point, you would be able to determine who gets an apple based on what they can exchange. We've been living under that system for so long that we have difficulty imagining another way to do it. In such a system, a person has a motive to get all the apples, not because they want to eat them, not because they need them, but simply because apples then become a means to an end, that end being power. A reason to hoard has thus been established. The person knows that there are 10 people out there who want apples. So if they can control the 5 apples in existence, then they get those 10 people to compete for them. No matter the result, at least 5 people will go without apples, and the one person in control will have power over them. This type of system creates power imbalances in societies. The best way to solve the problem is through overwhelming abundance. What if, in this world where 10 people want an apple each, there exists millions of apples? There's no longer an issue. Everyone gets an apple, period. Not only is there not an opportunity for exploitation, but most importantly, in such a world, there is not even a motive for exploitation. No power balance will occur, but an additional obstacle to the power imbalance is that there would be no incentive for a power imbalance. This also largely solves the problem of theft. Why would anyone steal an apple from someone in a world of unlimited and available apples? And even if they did, would it really be that much of a problem? But how could all products be unlimited? That's wasteful and logistically impossible, right? Yes, but there's a way around that. First, think of televisions as a more practical, real-world example. When I was a kid, we had a 17-inch black and white TV. If you adjusted the antenna just right, you may have been able to get 5 or 6 channels on it, all very staticky. Yes, it was crappy, but it was valuable to us, and it would have been very costly for us to replace it with a better one. Now, I was told that a flat screen like the kind that you would see on the wall in a futuristic science fiction movie would be impossible because of the way TVs worked with cathode ray tubes. Now, that's an old way of thinking, intruding upon what's actually possible. So, in 2003, or there around, I saw for the first time a shiny new flat-screen plasma TV capable of 1080p resolution on sale at Sears for $10,000. the cost of a pretty good used car back then. The TV was thick, heavy, and needed a specialized installation, but it could hang on your wall and not take up much space, just like a science fiction movie. I asked the salesman when the price would go down, and he told me it will never go down. Well, I didn't buy that, figuratively and literally, and I was right to do so. Today, you can buy a 70-inch TV with 4K resolution for a few $100s. They're better, cheaper, and far more abundant than they used to be. An even more impressive example would be what happened to digital storage. My computer has about 40 terabytes of storage capacity. None of it was particularly expensive, but guess what the price would be for that much storage capacity in the year that I was 4 years old? Go on, take a guess. $1,000? $10,000? $1 million? No. In the year 1980, my computer's hard drive capacity would cost $17.5 billion. That's because the cost to store 1 gigabyte of information on a hard drive back then was $438,000. In 2022, however, the average cost to store 1 gigabyte of information on a hard drive was 1 cent, 1 penny. And it can be done drastically faster, better, cheaper, and smaller than in 1980. Something a bit similar to what happened to TVs and digital storage needs to happen with everything else, but to an even more extreme degree. And no, I'm not saying electronics are like everything else, but it may be more possible than you think, because most of the obstacles are man-made and have to do with labor and distribution, not scarcity. Scarcity is usually artificial. How is scarcity artificial on a macro scale? After all, there cannot physically be an abundance of everything, right? Well, there could be, but not with the way we currently distribute goods, because our current system incentivizes international outsourcing to factories with slave labor, which also makes taxes lower and profit margins larger. Those are abstract obstacles that don't need to exist. It's just human beings screwing each other over to gain an advantage, aka selfishness. So that's a clear incentive structure that needs to be affected. Those are perverse incentives, which is also known as the Cobra effect. The Cobra effect is when a bad policy makes the problem worse rather than correcting it. The term comes from India, where people were concerned about an overpopulation of cobras. So the British government offered you a reward for each dead cobra you turned in. This resulted in cobra breeding. So the government ended that policy, which resulted in breeders just releasing their cobras, resulting in more cobras than ever before, caused by an effort to get rid of cobras. What a lot of people don't realize is that we've already solved a lot of abundance issues. What we have now is more of a distribution issue brought about via artificially created problems. So a couple of things need to happen for universal abundance to be possible. The first requires a paradigm shift in manufacturing, a change similar to the level of the assembly line. We would need to consolidate and localize all manufacturing. That would mean having very flexible, generalized, automated factories, along with storage buffers and maybe even integrated recycling. These would exist everywhere. They could produce anything, and they would be decentralized to make any potential corruption more difficult. So, for example, Let's say you need a new chair. In an ideal society, there's unlimited potential chairs, and that's how nobody is able to create and exploit a chair market, which is also why we no longer need supply and demand data on chairs. Supply would always meet demand. It's also why nobody would steal chairs nor design them around planned obsolescence. People wouldn't even need a new chair very often if they were built to last. But how can there be unlimited potential chairs? Well, there's actually just a buffer of chairs between you and the super advanced mega factory. You order up a chair and it is sent to you from the storage buffer. When you receive it, you either turn in your old one for recycling or keep it if you want both chairs. It doesn't matter. The automated factory creates a new chair to restock the supply buffer. Technically, it's not unlimited chairs, but functionally it is. There would be no need to retool a factory for different products. The robots within would need to be flexible enough to produce anything, and they could all coordinate across a network so their work would be incredibly fast and efficient, creating potential abundance, eliminating supply chain issues, and the need to ship goods over long distances, with the exception of some raw materials, and even that could be mitigated with recycling. Everything would become extremely inexpensive, so much so that there would be no reason to accumulate wealth. Everyone would already be able to afford everything, and that would make wealth meaningless, thus removing its power. That's an important goal. If power were removed from wealth, then corruption could be removed from it as well. Not only would you eliminate a major factor that causes corruption, but you'd also eliminate the incentive behind most crime. This world of superabundance probably would not be possible in a world that is very overpopulated. Population needs to scale with what can actually be produced and maintained. That would not require any sort of genocide or eugenics. When the needs of the people are being met and when they are comfortable, they actually tend to have fewer children. The problem with declining birth rates now has to do with aging populations and shrinking workforces. A declining population is only a problem because of how poorly we designed our world around sustained growth, which mathematically cannot go on forever. So the population problem is inevitable, even if you think we're not overpopulated right now. We cannot have perpetual growth. So those chickens will come home to roost eventually. And that coming decline would not be a problem, however, with widespread automation to aid in the inevitable transition. Besides that, with the passing of the larger, older generations, an equilibrium of age would develop. In other words, the older would not drastically outnumber the younger anymore as population transitions into a smaller size. So, for this world of superabundance, we should have something more like around 2 billion people, probably, which was the population of the 1920s, or maybe even 1 billion, which is more like the year 1800. But those 1 billion people would live very well. There would be no pressure to have children for labor or to take care of you in old age. That's because labor would be largely automated and the population would stabilize. The more difficult obstacle to reducing the population would be ideological. The desire to pass on your family line would need to be understood as a relic of the past that is devoted to vanity. That, like other traditions, would have to be seen for what they are: symbolic devotion that should have no major influence and are relegated to pure recreation. That means all traditions should be voluntary and have zero authority to dictate society in any way. That's the hard part. That means These things need to be seen largely as the archaic cultural hang-ups they are. Now, I understand that there are those who believe we need such hang-ups because they teach us deeper truths, and that at the very least they must have survived because they serve a necessary purpose of some sort. But such truths can be taught without ritual and without distortion. We can use the explanatory power of analogy, allegory, and metaphor without making them sacred, without intellectually chaining ourselves to them, thereby making us the mental slaves of masters from ages past. If that can be achieved on a global scale, then it makes the next aspect of the ideal society easier to accomplish. And if we could accomplish it, a lot of problems would be eliminated, because it would also eliminate the source of the major power plays that affect our world and cause it to be greatly imbalanced. That great accomplishment would be to eliminate all countries. They would not need to exist anymore, period. If the need to adhere to cultural traditions were relaxed on a global scale, then we'd begin to recognize each other as fellow human beings rather than citizens of other countries. Human beings would have ultimate freedom. They'd be free to go anywhere in the world they wish, except for your personal home, of course. The only border to be respected would be the literal walls of your home, where you could have privacy. But nobody could tell you that you're forbidden from this land or that due to some invisible line on a map. The big question a lot of people would probably ask is, who gets to be the one world government? And what if we can't all agree on what that government should be? Just asking such questions means we're not yet ready for that sort of thinking. First, we'd have to do away with the idea of sanctifying traditions, because that's how various cultures become authoritarian about their ways and thus try to impose certain ideals that must be cordoned off by borders due to people who disagree with such ways. For there to be no borders, everyone would have to be on the same page regarding the fundamentals. The only way for that to happen is if everyone had a mutual respect for individual freedom. That means abandoning the authoritarianism of traditionalism. That doesn't mean you cannot participate in traditions. The very idea of individual freedom means that you can participate in traditions. All it means is that you cannot impose your traditions. So if we can get to a point in which most people of the world value individual freedom without any sort of regional restraints imposed by such things as traditions, religions, or conflicting economic philosophies, etc., then we can finally do away with borders and become a global society. And given the fate of the planet, like it or not, we eventually need to be a global society. And I'd rather such a society be achieved voluntarily, valuing freedom, rather than via some brutal authoritarian regime. A side effect of a world without countries, or any sort of similar tribalistic groupings, is that there would be fewer reasons for wars. Having communities with an overkill of resource production would also eliminate a major motive for war. So solving the problems of region and resource would both drastically reduce, if not eliminate altogether, any reason to go to war. Now, this may seem laughably unrealistic to you, but consider history. We started with tribes, villages, towns, city-states, and moved on to kingdoms, colonies, nations, and empires. And now we have very large alliances that span the globe. The separations have gotten bigger and bigger with time. So now there are fewer. And my hope is that such separations get large enough to overlap and eventually evaporate altogether. that we just take it a little bit further, and that the resulting global society values personal freedom. Though I admit that sounds far-fetched, the advent of the internet has already begun to bring us closer to a global society than many people ever thought possible. Perhaps before the true elimination of countries, they would relate to each other the way states of the United States relate to each other. You could easily cross a state border without even realizing it, and nobody cares. The United States itself has many different regional cultures contained within it. Yet we Americans are allowed to freely travel to whatever state those different cultures exist. In other words, the world should be both bigger and smaller in the perfect opposite of the way it is now. Currently, the world is smaller due to the ways you are limited in citizenship, but larger in ways due to reliance on global trade and centralized government. It should be the opposite. The world should be larger in terms of citizenship, as in there is no such thing as citizenship and you are simply a person of the world with complete freedom. But it should be smaller in terms of local reliance. In other words, communities should be self-sufficient without reliance on goods being brought to them from the other side of the world. Everything would be decentralized, yet connected, like independent nodes. Government would essentially be implicit and unnoticeable. This would look very different than the world we have now. It would be a world of efficient, aesthetically pleasing communities designed around people rather than vehicles. This means there would be no need for massive vehicle infrastructure like highways, parking, and global trade routes that clog our seas and skies. Everything you need will be within walking distance, with assistance available if necessary. These communities would thus use space much more efficiently and would not need to be as large as a modern city. There would be no such thing as urban sprawl. Each of these communities could have its own factories, capable of producing what it needs. Perhaps there could be fully automated and climate-controlled vertical farms. In such communities, it would seem absurd that people of the past shipped bananas thousands of miles from South America, for instance. They'd grow their own bananas. The only global shipping would be that of raw materials that are unique to specific regions. There would be more homes than people. Homelessness would not be an issue. Vacancies would not become dilapidated because maintenance could be automated, or people could do it themselves if they so wished. Communal and recreational areas would be prioritized to encourage offline socialization. Nature would be integrated rather than eliminated. But beyond the self-sufficient community, there would be wide swaths of nothing but nature. The many unnecessary roads and strip malls of the old world would be grown over and returned to the earth, and the earth would become healthy again as our carbon footprint drops. Energy could largely be generated by nuclear power until something better comes along, perhaps fusion. Besides that, supplementary power could be derived depending on the region, solar, wind, wave, geothermal, etc. In such communities of overwhelming abundance, there would be no materialism. Rather than status being derived from what you own, because anybody could effectively own anything, it would be derived from what you can do, whether that requires your intellect, skill, talent, etc. Because contribution would be prioritized over materialism, it would naturally result in a built-in motive to better humanity. Work would become a thing for the sheer betterment of people rather than the accumulation of wealth, as wealth would no longer be a logical thing to strive for. It would not make sense to put forth effort toward that goal anymore. It would be a world where people don't work for the betterment of a company or a country, but for humanity in general. How does your work benefit humanity? That would be the more pertinent question. But your work should not define you either, because you're not only the benefactor, but also the beneficiary. The concept of profit would become archaic and replaced with the concept of effectiveness. Working for survival would not even be a thing. That would seem like a laughably primitive relic, the way we might look at caveman behavior. Nobody is going homeless, hungry, or without medicine because they didn't work enough. Why would that be the case when there's more than enough for everyone and it's all distributed locally? It would be like trying to keep sand away from someone on a beach. It wouldn't even make sense to try. Work would not be linked to material possession. It would be linked to contribution. Those who advance society, for instance, via the arts or sciences, would be celebrated. But those who fail to do so would not be subjugated in any way. No, they would be seen as the rightful beneficiaries they are, simply by being human beings with natural rights. The world of the past, our world, the world of profit and materialism, would be almost incomprehensible to people of such communities. Education would only be standardized up until the basics required to function effectively in society. Knowledge of how to do things that automation now does would also be freely available so that human beings never forget how to live without automation. Beyond that, a person could be educated in whatever interests they wish to cultivate. If you want to learn a new trade and change careers, then that should be easy and natural with zero fear, because the incentive structure around such a society would be focused on working to advance society. People would naturally gravitate to the arts, sciences, and engineering. I'd imagine that history would also be an important topic so that we could learn from the mistakes of the past and understand how to avoid them. In this worldwide society of self-sufficient communities, there is no hiding anything that affects the public. All information about things that affect us is fully transparent and available to everyone. There's no such thing as top secret information available only to a privileged few. Things like patents, proprietary information, and intellectual property would be unnecessary in such a society. Attribution would still exist, but copyright would not. The motive would be for your ideas and work to be more freely used because they're good, so they make life better. The truth should be freely available and easy to find without it being buried beneath a mountain of lies and propaganda. Such untruths should be seen as the obstacles they are to a healthy society. It should be the ultimate shame to perpetuate falsehood on purpose. This would be easier to accomplish without the usual incentive structures that provide motive to spread falsehood, such as profit, power, and materialism. Without those being prioritized, social media would also naturally transform. Scams and attempts to game the system would largely go away on their own. The way we do things now is that we make everything an arms race between people who build the systems and the people who try to break the systems. That's unsustainable. The far more intelligent way to handle things would be through the incentive structures themselves. So 1,000 years from now, I want people to see us as being far more primitive than we currently see people from 1,000 years ago. I want the people of 1,000 years from now to think it was ridiculous that we had a world of abundance but restricted it from each other due to profit and distribution. Ridiculous that we shipped goods around the world because of such abstract man made obstacles, like ways to avoid expensive labor and taxes. Ridiculous that a major motive for people was the accumulation of wealth, while for others it was doing undesirable work just to survive. Ridiculous that we traveled so much every day in traffic, belching greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, being miserable for having to do it, yet doing it anyway. I want them to see it as ridiculous that we made things inefficiently and poorly on purpose, resulting in enormous amounts of waste simply because it helped drive wealth to the powerful few at the expense of the many. I want you to fully understand just how ridiculous and unsustainable our current world is, and that we just don't see it because we were born into it. I want you to understand that because our society is not sustainable, its end is inevitable. And that end could either be a painful disaster into tragedy, or it could be a beautiful transition into triumph. I want you to fully understand just how much better it could be, and that the main obstacle is our own will to actually do it. Not only because the rich and the powerful prefer the current world where they get to be the ones in control, but because we allowed them to be. The fault is ours as well, collectively. The world could be better if we simply allowed it to be.